All right, welcome everybody to Do More Better. This is our inaugural podcast. It's the first one we've ever done. We figure before we ever get into psychological material and real discussion about stuff, we were going to take the opportunity to introduce ourselves, tell you a little bit about who we are, why we think this is important to do, and what our goals are and what you guys can expect when you listen to one of our shows. So I'm Dr. Wes Sheely. This is Dr. Drew Heckman. Drew, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are?
Sure. We're trying to decide if I'm going by Dr. Drew or not.
I will call you Dr. Drew when it's funny to me.
It's always hilarious. So, yeah. So I'm Drew Heckman. I am a licensed psychologist. I've been a psychologist for the past 10-ish years. Got a PhD in psychology around 2009. And then been practicing clinical psychology. Initially started working mostly with kids, did a lot of work with young kids. And then what happened is the more I worked, I started working with more teenagers, and then working with more teenagers, I ended up working with more young adults. And now I've worked with, kids the age of 4 up to adults in their 40s. I'd say that's about it. I kind of, like working kind of with all areas, anxiety, depression, habits, increases and caprices, you name it. I think I've kind of done it all. So
yeah. Anything in particular that's like your favorite to work with?
I mean, it used to be, I kind of got my name in doing a lot of family work and working with, like high conflict families. I like doing that. It's just hard.
Yeah.
It's really difficult.
Yeah. I think for some of the, with younger kids, it's almost always easy to, like, the families love you because you fix something, whether it's like a pooping problem or a peeing problem, or, they're biting somebody. Like, you can get that stuff to stop and they love you forever. But when you deal with those families, or you deal with, high functioning adolescents or adults, it's harder to get the feedback that you did the job you were, supposed to do. Exactly.
And so that's how I got started, was working in juvenile justice and working with kids who had offended, and they had to do family therapy. It's really rewarding work, and I enjoy doing it. It's just also really difficult. So now I think I'd prefer your typical anxiety cases and things like that.
Really similar to Drew. My background is, I have a PhD in psychology. I'm a licensed psychologist. I was originally trained as a school psychologist and worked in the Kentucky public schools, and then went back to graduate school, got my PhD at University of Cincinnati. I think you got your PhD in 2009, got mine in 2010. Mm-hmm. We were interns together, did my postdoc, and then we met up again at another postdoc. We were both at the Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and now I've been doing clinical work for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. Similar to Drew, I do ages basically 2 to 19, mostly typically developing kids, but all kinds of issues. I'd say my favorite is working with adolescents that are kind of on the verge of getting ready to go into adulthood and trying to figure out what they actually want to do with their lives, because I think figuring that out is actually pretty difficult. 500 years ago, it was pretty easy. You knew got to go hunt and plow the field that day. And now we just have such a range of opportunities. I love talking to 17-year-olds that are looking at college or a trade and what they want to do.
You might want to explain what typically developing means.
Yeah, typically developing means that they don't have some sort of genetic issue. Their IQ is probably in the average range. These kids are going through education the way you would expect a child to go through education. Their social skills, for the most part, are not so severe that they are secluded from a regular classroom or something like that. So most of the time when we talk about typically developing kids on our podcast, we're talking about any kid who's age 2 to 19 that may be behind or delayed or catching up or something like that. But for the most part, we can expect those motor skills, those speech skills, those basic living skills to be somewhere close to what we would expect from most of their peers.
Right. So, if we're keeping it simple, basically not on the autism spectrum.
Right. That's probably
the most simple way to describe it. We both have worked with kids on the spectrum at some point, or adults on the spectrum at some point, but it's just not our specialty.
Let's talk a little bit about why we're doing the podcast.
Right. So we've talked about this a couple of times, why we're doing the podcast, and I think we've come up with a new a new reason. And our reason was because we complained too much. Wasn't that what we decided?
Well, to give you guys some background, we are really good friends. This is my best friend, and we constantly are going through our craft together. That's always what we do. And we get together and it just gravitates, and it's constant where we're talking about what we see in the field, what we do in our work. I think we have a lot of similar views on just what's supposed to go on in a therapy room. There's, a therapist should have some chops. They should have some moves. They should have some art to the science.
Right. I think we've been doing this now 8 years of complaining to each other. And I don't think we always saw it as complaining to each other. I think we saw it as consulting to each other and trying to be better at what we do. I think only recently that I've started seeing it as complaining to each other. And I think generally speaking, when you find you have a complaint in your life, there is something that is unsatisfying, or there's something that you find yourself, spending time thinking about, or spending some of your cognitive energy on, you should turn that complaint into an action. And that's what this is we decided to, rather than just complain to each other, we're speaking to our choir, we decided to talk to some people who might actually be interested in what we're saying and learn something from it.
We're both probably at a position too where when we were starting off together as interns, we couldn't do this podcast. We were not ready. Our skill sets at that time were getting better and learning. And now, after having been working in the field for 10 years and working with clinical needs and children, we kind of have an idea that in order to keep getting better, which is, hey, do more better. In order to keep getting better, that's more difficult, and we have to up the stakes. And this is supposed to be upping the stakes. We believe reaching out to more than one family at a time is upping the stakes,
right,
and putting it out there in the world for it to be consumed.
Right.
And a lot of therapy is figuring out what you want. And when we have some sort of jaded experience, or we come together and what we think is consultation turns into complaining, it's typically, hey, this person is saying this, and it's just they've got no clue what they want, and they really are doing what is actually probably counterproductive for what they want.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm gonna, just to not sound too jaded, I think that we both generally have a view that people are doing the best they can.
Absolutely.
And people are generally well intended too. They just have really bad ways of showing it sometimes. They get stuck in bad habits. They have bad ways of looking at things. They try the same thing over and over again, and if it doesn't work, they just try it harder. And so I would say who we complain about would be, I'm sorry, parents sometimes.
Or it could be the kids. Sometimes you get a wildcat in the office,
Yeah, sometimes the kid. Other clinicians.
That's probably a big part of this, I'd say. You and I get together and feel, I think, at the very least comforted that somebody else is seeing some of the same things. And there's just a lot of things in our field right now that you and I would probably say people are not talking about enough, not talking about at all, or it's almost, blatantly being subverted in some ways. And so there's a lot of things that I think, we'll see if we can't do all this without getting canceled. We'll try to keep you guys with good information without crossing a line somewhere that we don't want to cross yet. But probably at some point, it just comes down to there's a lot of things in the field that deserve a little more attention and a lot more discussion. And for a lot of you out there, it's difficult to get that information. If you go on Facebook and you read a psychological article, you're probably reading an article that a journalist wrote or a blogger wrote. You're not reading from a psychologist, let alone someone who did the study and the discussion section from the study or something like that.
Agreed.
But we hope that one big reason is we think we've got good information to give everyone, and that information comes down to we think we can do better than that article you clicked on Facebook.
Agreed. I wish I could count the number of times I get an opinion editorial that comes to me that really has no evidence base, no scientific background, not even a theoretical background to it, that is, I feel it was, for me, it was so easy to pick apart. And I'm not that bright. And when you get an education in psychology and you get an education in research and get an education.
By the way, that's totally inaccurate. You're super bright. But anyway, he's humble.
But you get an education in looking for problems in methodology or looking for problems in conclusions. And I think that's what I hope to bring to this is the people that we complain about, I would like to reach them.
Yeah.
And I would like to say sorry for complaining and start doing something about it.
We should do more better.
We should do it. I'd rather, turn it into an action. And if you've got an idea, speak up about it and play a bigger game.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that.
We should probably talk about that, yeah.
Like I said, we probably couldn't do this podcast when we were interns. The game then was smaller, as it should be. A lot of interns start with protocols. A lot of people coming in to our offices, we are trying to work with them about playing a smaller game, that they're taking on something that the end goal is just, it's all consuming, and it can take you over, and it gets really difficult to see light at the end of the tunnel. And sometimes if you can work with people to just simply break down those problems. But for us at this point, playing a bigger game is putting a little more on the line, reaching more than one family at a time. And
sure. Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to unpack in what you just said. The protocols, what do you mean?
Just so interns basically come in, and when they're getting trained, a lot of treatments get put into protocols, and you should do it, do this step and then this step and then this step.
It's like putting together a car or putting together.
Absolutely. And then once you get to a level of fluency with the skill and you can do it on your own, you can make shift and change around how you want to go about that as you see fit. I'd probably say, when I look at any given session that I do with a family, I could probably find 5 different paradigms and 5 different, psychological theories going on all at the same time. And a lot of that starts with protocols, but it's not really a protocol.
No, you're right. I think being a good therapist, sometimes I say is like being like Miles Davis or John Coltrane. You
right.
know? Like they could play the scales, and they were masterful at playing those scales. But they've moved past the scales, and now what they do is they move over here and they play in this for a little bit, and they come back and play in that, and that's what being a good therapist is. And so those protocols that you talk about, these are things designed for research. They're designed so that we can tell, does this actually work?
Right.
So if we can get 5 therapists doing the exact same thing, they're not designed for people who can play jazz. We don't want John Coltrane to just play, the A major scale.
Learn the scales, do it the right way.
Nobody's showing up to listen to that.
Right.
Right. They're showing up to listen to him improv and just go over on this tangent and come back and make it just sound artful. And that's really what good therapy is. And I think that like you said, we couldn't have played that game until you do it for 10 years. Yeah. And so the whole point, I think, in doing this was to start playing a bigger game for ourselves and to be a little more vulnerable and to take a risk and to just quit talking about the ideas between the two of us and put them out there and have our listeners evaluate them and decide if they suck, because some of them probably will.
If you're listening and you think something's wrong, we'd really like to know that. We want to know what you have to say. We want to know what to talk about and where to take some of it sometimes. Agreed.
I think that part of this is selfish. We constantly do this to challenge each other, and this would be, is we're going to put this out. Hopefully, there's going to be dozens and dozens of people watching this.
Dozens upon dozens.
I mean,
not just our mothers.
20 people watching this. I mean, crazy. And one of the 20 is probably 19 of the 20 are smarter than us. And we'll find a problem and we'll send us a question. And we'll send us a, did you read this article? And we can say, we didn't think about it that way. We really appreciate that. And maybe we can become better at what we do, because we really like being therapists.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Really do. And that gets into kind of what we hope this becomes.
Yeah, let's talk about that, what we hope this becomes.
So I think the thing we've kind of settled on, we hope it becomes a dialogue, a back and forth between us and our listeners. Is the people who've decided that we were worth sticking around to watch, making fart jokes and talking about psychology. All 5 of you stick around to watch. We hope that you will send us questions. You will say, I had this issue come up with my kid, or I've got this issue coming up with my partner. I have this issue coming up in my life, and put it into a question, because you're not the only one with the question. And then we can evaluate it, we can talk about it, and we can possibly give some advice, or at least give you some guidance in it. That's what we would hope, so that way we can turn this into a back and forth where really it's guided by our listeners.
Yeah, I would hope listeners can expect that a dialogue for sure, but typically our dialogue is probably not going to be maybe exactly what you expected from a psychologist, or exactly what you expected from someone that you think is just giving advice all the time or something. But basically, send us questions, and that's what we really want, is to know your questions and to talk about them. We probably have a good idea what some of those questions are, but shoot them to us. And going back and forth with a dialogue, we think that we've got something to offer with your questions and what's going to go on with that stuff.
Right. I like that. I don't think it's going to be exactly what you expected from a psychologist.
Yeah. I'm sure you're watching this right now and understanding that we're probably not what you expected from psychologists already.
It's so often that
a couple PE teachers doing a podcast.
Right. I meet somebody in the gym and, you like squat 800 pounds and and you're a child psychologist. Yeah. It's very rare.
Oh, the look I get when I tell people what I do is just, it's worth $1 million right there.
Yeah. Well, we hang out at the Big Red and we hang out at a place to watch football on Sundays, and we'd been waited on for over a year by the same people. And at one point they asked what we do, and the assumption was that we were construction workers or that we're firemen, firefighters.
Yeah. So next episode, if you follow along here, we're going to start going into psychological principles and probably some topics that we enjoy more than anything. But we're really looking forward to your questions, and eventually it'll mold into that more than anything. But if you haven't already, click like and subscribe, and we'll see you next episode.
Thank you.
Don't forget to click like and subscribe. You can follow us on our Instagram at DMB Psychology for updates and to submit any comments or questions. You can also find us on our website, domorebetter.buzzsprout.com, where we have info on all episodes as well as our donations and merchandise links if you'd like to support the podcast. You can search for us on YouTube and all major podcast platforms under Do More Better.